silver gleamed though no hand had polished it. Candles flickered too low, their wax dripping like melted bone. They say the chairs creaked before anyone dared to sit. It begins, as all cursed nights do, with a table that waits. Long before the footsteps came, long before the doors groaned open, the dining room of the Natchez plantation already breathed. The shutters rattled though no wind touched them. The chandeliers swayed though no hand disturbed the air. Thy silence pressed against the walls, heavy as the humid Mississippi heat but colder, like a stillness borrowed from the grave. On that night, the silverware did not merely gleam. It glared, reflecting not the dim light of the candles but some pallid glow that seemed to seep up from the wood of the table itself. The spoons and knives lay in perfect rows, each one sharpened to precision by unseen hands. And yet no servant had set them. No polish had touched them. They waited as though memory itself had arranged them, a memory that wanted its ritual completed once more. The candles, tall as bone towers, burned low. The wax fell in rivulets down their length, pale and clotted like marrow spilled from a shattered tibia. Every drop hardened into grotesque shapes, knuckles, teeth, and sockets, mocking the living with the faces of the dead. Some swore the wax hissed when it touched the tablecloth, as though the cloth recoiled from its touch. And the chairs, the chairs, 12 of them carved from cypress, tall-backed and black with the oil of decades. They lined the table like sentinels. Their seats sagged from weight long gone, yet when the hour neared they groaned and creaked, as if invisible forms lowered themselves into place. A low chorus of wood straining under phantom bodies. Those who later whispered of that night said this sound came first, before a single guest crossed the threshold. In the corners of the room, shadows stretched too far. The firelight did not reach them, though it should have. They seemed to lean forward, stretching across the floor like spectators eager for the play to begin. The clock above the mantel ticked too loud, each second tolling like a funeral bell. And then, stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the throat ache to swallow. It was not the stillness of peace nor of quiet comfort. It was the stillness of waiting, of something crouched in the dark just beyond the veil of sight. A pause not empty but swollen with dread. The table had been set in silence, yes, but it was not silence that belonged to the living. It was the hush that falls when the dead gather close enough to listen. Those who cleaned the house later swore they found the tablecloth already stained before supper began. Brown circles, dark as dried blood, ringed the center where the bowls would soon be placed. Some claimed the stains formed shapes, chains broken, eyes hollow, a serpent coiled. Others said it was only spilled wine, seeped into linen and preserved by the heat. Yet none could explain why when the cloth was stripped away. The table itself bore the same marks carved faintly into its wood, as though the stains had burned down into memory. The kitchen staff muttered of it in hushed tones. "The table knows," they whispered when no master could hear. "It remembers." No polish, no scrubbing could erase the symbols that emerged on its surface. And so when the hour came, and the great doors of the dining hall yawned open, there was no cheer to greet the entering guests. No chatter of forks, no clatter of glasses. Only the slow, deliberate shuffle of feet across the wooden floor. The masters entered first, lord of the house, his lady, their sons and daughters dressed in lace that glimmered like cobwebs. Behind them came overseers, their boots heavy, their smiles too sharp. And behind even them the lesser kin, those who clung to the plantation's wealth like dogs gnawing the last scraps of bone. Each carried their laughter in their throats, but none dared to let it spill into the air, not yet. The silence of the room held them captive. Their eyes flicked to the silver, to the wax, to the shadows. Some laughed nervously, brushing it off as tricks of light, as dust and age. But one among them muttered low, "Why do the chairs sound like they've already been filled?" The remark was silenced by a sharp look from the master. They took their seats. The chairs groaned again, louder now, as though acknowledging fresh weight upon old wood. Forks were lifted, glasses tapped, yet still the room felt too crowded. It was as if others sat among them, others unseen. The slaves lingered at the edges of the hall, eyes lowered as custom demanded. Yet one girl did not bow. Her gaze burned from the shadows of the doorway, unflinching, unbroken. Her name was Clara. Her eyes alone disturbed the silence more than any word could have, but her moment comes later, for now the table itself ruled the room. And as the first bowls of stew were carried forward, as the ladles dipped heavy with the night's meal, The candles flickered, not with air, but as though something unseen passed among them. The flames bent toward the table's center, toward the empty space where no dish yet sat. The silver shivered on the cloth. The clock struck, and outside the window the cypress trees bent in unison. Though no wind touched their leaves, something had already joined them at the table. In a land where silence was demanded, hers was a gaze that burned through chains. They whispered her name in the kitchens as though it were a hex. Every glance she gave was a promise of reckoning. The chair scraped, though no hand touched it, and all eyes flicked toward the sound. Yet it was not the chair that mattered. It was the girl who stood framed in the doorway. Clara. Her figure was slight, shoulders narrow from years bent over work, but there was a stillness to her that unnerved. She did not bow, did not drop her gaze to the floor as all others had. The candlelight caught her face in fragments, cheekbone, jaw, the curve of her mouth set tight. But her eyes did not belong to the room. They belonged to something older, sharper, a fire drawn not from hearth or flame, but from the marrow of injustice itself. She had been bought at 15, a body added to the ledger, another set of hands for the kitchen. Years had pressed upon her, carved scars in skin and deeper ones in silence, yet silence had never claimed her. Even when beaten for speaking, even when the lash sang across her back, she had looked her masters in the eye. They hated it. They called it insolence. They called it wickedness. But in hushed tones the other servants called it something else. They called it prophecy. In the kitchens her name was whispered like a hex, not too loud lest the overseer's ear catch it, but enough that it carried like smoke through the quarters. Clara, the one who stared, the one who knew. Mothers would hush their children with it, saying, "Keep quiet, or Clara will look upon you." And yet behind those words of warning there was respect. Fear not of her, but of what her gaze promised, a reckoning no chain could bind. And that night, as the bowls were carried forward, as the master's hand reached for his spoon, Clara's gaze was a knife across the table. She did not move. She did not speak. But every guest felt the weight of her eyes pressing against their skin. It was as though she sat among them, though she stood apart, as though her presence filled the 12th chair that no one dared to occupy. The master's wife, pale as milk, shifted in her seat. Her hands trembled around the stem of her glass. She whispered, "Make her lower her eyes." The overseer, half drunk already on anticipation of the feast, barked, "Girl, look down." But Clara did not obey. The silence swelled again. Forks hovered, spoons trembled. The shadows leaned closer, eager. And then Clara did something no slave in that house had dared. She smiled. It was not wide, not joyous. It was small, almost invisible, but it carried more terror than any scream. For it was the smile of someone who knew what the night would bring. The smile of a witness who had already seen the end. Her lips parted, and her voice came low, no louder than the rustle of wax dripping onto cloth. Yet every ear caught it, as though the words were not carried by air but pressed directly into the skull. "You will eat," she said. The overseer rose halfway from his seat, but his hand faltered. Something unseen pressed him back down, chair creaking beneath his weight. "You will eat," Clara repeated, "and you will not rise again." The master slammed his palm against the table. "Silence her," he barked. But the command faltered at the edges, trembling like old timber. His eyes, for all his fury, refused to meet hers. No one moved. Not the servants lining the wall, not the guests whose faces grew ashen beneath powder and rouge. They were caught in her gaze, in the promise burning within it. The kitchen's whispers had not lied. Clara's glance was no mere defiance. It was a curse etched into the marrow of her being, a curse sharpened by every night of hunger, every hour of toil, every lash of leather that cut skin but never spirit. Some swore, later, that when she spoke, the chains in the quarters rattled in answer, that the iron itself remembered her words. The spoons dipped into the bowls. The stew, thick and dark, steamed with a scent that seemed too sweet, too heavy. Some inhaled and smiled unaware. Others frowned, noses wrinkling as though the air carried something it should not. But Clara only watched. Her eyes never lowered. The master's son raised his spoon first, eager to prove his courage. He shoved the mouthful down, chewed and grinned too wide. "It is rich tonight," he declared, voice echoing. The others followed. Some laughed, some nodded, all ate. And Clara's gaze burned across them, marking each one, branding them in silence. The clock tolled again. The shadows shifted closer. The silver trembled, and still she would not lower her eyes. The stew boiled thick, yet the air carried a sweetness it should not. Her hand stirred slow, as if guiding something older than fire. What she dropped in the pot was not of the earth they tilled. The kitchens of the Natchez plantation had always smelled of smoke and meat, of salt pork boiled down with beans, of cornbread baked until its crust turned black. On most nights the scents carried into the quarters, stirring hunger like a blade twisting in the gut. But that night the smell was different. The stew that sat upon the great iron pot simmered with a richness the house had never known. Thick, dark, it bubbled as though it contained not only meat and root, but marrow itself, drawn from something far beneath the ground. Clara stood before it, her hand slow upon the wooden spoon. Each motion was deliberate, as if she was not stirring broth but coaxing something awake. Steam rose, curling around her wrists like white snakes. The fire beneath the pot snapped and hissed, but its smoke carried a sweetness no wood could produce. It was a sweetness that clung to the tongue even before tasting, a sweetness that made the stomach twist with longing and dread at once. No one dared ask what she had added. The other girls in the kitchen only watched from corners, eyes wide, lips trembling. They had seen her slip something into the pot, something wrapped in cloth, something that did not splash but sank with unnatural grace. The cloth unraveled in the heat, and what it revealed was never spoken aloud. Those who glimpsed it swore their hearts beat wrong after, as if their blood had remembered a rhythm not their own. Clara's lips moved as she stirred, but the words did not carry like speech. They slid beneath the crackle of fire, low and rhythmic, like the hum of bees deep within their hive. Some thought it prayer. Others thought it song. But it was neither nor both. It was older than the hymns sung on Sunday, older than the chants muttered in secret when the moon hung swollen. It was a language that came not from her, but through her, as though the air itself had borrowed her tongue. One girl whispered, "She feeds it." Another clamped her hand over her mouth, fearful the words alone would summon notice, because they all knew there was something in the pot besides meat and root, something unseen yet heavy as stone. The broth grew darker, the bubbles slower. The scent thickened until it pressed against the walls, creeping into every crevice of the kitchen, pushing at the doors. It drifted down the halls toward the dining room, where the table already waited. It drifted into the quarters, where chains clinked uneasily in the dark. It drifted out into the fields, where the cane stalks shivered though no wind touched them, and in every place it touched, silence deepened. The overseer came once, his boots striking the floor like blows. He sniffed the air, lips curling into a grin too sharp. "You put your best into it tonight," he said. Clara did not answer. She did not look at him. He laughed, mistaking her silence for obedience, and slapped the side of the pot with his palm. The stew splashed, drops hissing upon the fire. The overseer's laughter stuttered then. He pulled his hand back, frowning. A welt had risen where the steam kissed his flesh, raw and angry. He muttered and left, shaking his head. But the girls saw how his hand trembled as though chilled to the bone. When he was gone, Clara lifted the spoon one last time. She let the broth drip back into the pot, each drop striking like a heartbeat. Her eyes, dark and steady, did not blink. She reached into her apron and withdrew another bundle. Smaller this time, wrapped tight in thread that looked too fine, too pale, thread that might once have been hair. She did not unwrap it. She only pressed it into the stew with the back of the spoon, watching as the surface closed over it without a ripple, and the sweetness deepened into something unbearable. One of the younger girls whimpered. Clara turned her head then at last, and her gaze silenced the room. "Do not fear," she said, voice flat, voice certain. "Fear is for them." No one dared move as she lifted the pot from the fire. Alone she carried it to the waiting doors of the dining room. Her steps did not falter, though the weight should have bent her. The stew sloshed thick, but not a drop spilled. It was as though the pot itself obeyed her will. The doors opened on their own. The table yawned wide. The chairs shifted. The shadows leaned close, and into that silence, Clara set the stew. The unseen ingredient was already at work. The spoons would soon deliver it into every mouth, and the house would never rise the same again. The great oak doors opened as if to a funeral feast. Every seat filled, every smile stretched too wide. No one noticed the shadows had joined them at the table. The dining hall groaned awake when Clara carried in the pot. The doors, tall as the gallows beams, did not creak on their hinges. They sighed as if some pressure pushed from within. Candlelight flared higher, no longer timid but violent, throwing the guests into stark relief. White faces gleaming like skulls above collars and lace, eyes wet with anticipation. The stew's scent had reached them long before the pot itself did. They sat forward, nostrils flaring, bellies rumbling in greedy unison. Hunger had twined itself into their nerves, a hunger not of the body, but of something deeper. It was a hunger planted by what Clara had stirred into the broth. When she set the pot down, the silver trembled along the table. The spoons rattled against porcelain. The master raised his hands as though to bless the meal. But the gesture faltered. His mouth worked soundlessly before he remembered the words. "We give thanks," he said. But it sounded hollow. The overseer's hand, still welted from the kitchen, twitched at his side. Each servant who carried a dish seemed ghostly, their feet too light upon the floorboards, their eyes glazed with dread. And yet the masters smiled. Their smiles were wide, too wide. Lips stretched thin, teeth catching the light like rows of ivory knives. It was the kind of smile given not from joy but compulsion, as though some force twisted the muscles into place. They leaned close to their plates. Bowls were filled, ladles dipped heavy, and steam rose in tendrils that coiled upward like grasping hands. The scent thickened until the hall itself seemed drunk on it. The walls sweated with condensation, the windows clouded white, the very air swollen with sweetness. No one noticed when the shadows slipped in. At first they were no more than extensions of flame, bending and swaying across the tablecloth, but they grew darker, longer, stretching into the empty spaces between chairs, climbing the high ceiling beams. They clung to the cypress-carved chairs, pressing close to the seated guests. Their shapes were wrong, shoulders too narrow, arms too long, faces without outline yet heavy with suggestion. Still, no one noticed. The first spoon clattered against a bowl, and then another, until a chorus of scraping filled the silence. The family bent forward, lips parted, and the meal began. The master's son slurped eagerly, broth dripping down his chin. His eyes fluttered shut with delight, but when they opened again, they did not blink in rhythm with the others. Something behind them flickered, a light too dark to name. The mistress dabbed delicately at her lips, whispering, "So rich, so sweet." Her voice trembled as if in ecstasy, though her hands clenched her napkin until threads snapped. The overseer chuckled through his teeth, though his laugh carried no humor. "The girl has outdone herself," he muttered, though he never glanced at Clara. His gaze stayed fixed on the bowl as if terrified to look away. The silver clinked. Forks bit flesh. Knives sawed through bread, and the shadows ate with them. No one could see the movement at first. Only when a guest's arm twitched, lifting too high, did it become clear a second hand rested upon his wrist, guiding it. Only when the mistress's spoon dipped, trembling, did it become clear another mouth bent close beside hers, inhaling the same steam. They sat at the table, invisible yet undeniable. The unseen guests, the ones the cypress trees had borne witness to, long before the plantation had risen. They had returned now, their hunger unending, their seats reclaimed. Outside the windows the cypress swayed, Spanish moss dragged low, brushing glass panes with a hiss. The branches bent not with the wind but in reverence, leaning toward the house as if to listen. Their roots twisted deep into soil fattened by bodies, watered by blood. Those trees had seen every lash, every burial, every cry swallowed into silence. And tonight they gave back what they had gathered. The meal deepened. Laughter began to bubble up, sharp, brittle laughter that clawed the rafters. It sounded like joy, but it was not joy. It was a sound forced out, scraped from throats as though the shadows demanded tribute in laughter, before they demanded it in blood. Some guests laughed until tears streaked their cheeks, until their chests heaved, until their voices cracked raw. Yet still they shoveled food into their mouths, chewing, swallowing, feeding both themselves and what pressed close upon them. Clara stood at the far wall, eyes unblinking. She did not eat. She did not serve. She only watched, her expression unreadable. One of the daughters turned toward her then, mid-bite. Her lips trembled. Her eyes sought Clara's face, as if begging for some release, some mercy. But Clara's gaze gave none. The daughter's spoon clattered from her hand. She pressed a palm to her throat. Her smile remained stretched, fixed, grotesque. Her body began to shake, and no one stopped eating. The candles burned lower. The wax hissed. The clock above the mantel ticked louder, heavier, until each strike was like a coffin lid slamming shut. The cypress outside bent deeper, their branches scraping at the windows, tapping in rhythm with the clock. Inside, the table had no empty chairs. The shadows had all arrived. Forks scraped, wine spilled, and laughter clawed at the rafters. But the clock struck with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. One by one, the voices thinned into silence. At first, it seemed like merriment. The long hall rang with clinking glasses, with silver teeth gnawing against porcelain, with voices rising higher and higher, as if to shake free the weight that pressed upon them. The mistress laughed until her throat rattled, brittle and strained. The master's son bent back in his chair, roaring with mirth so loud his face purpled. Even the overseer, his hand still welted, howled into his wine, red spilling down his chin like blood. But this laughter was not born of joy. It was shrill, jagged, a sound dragged unwilling from their throats, each peal scraped raw from the chest. It rang sharp against the beams overhead, echoing until the rafters themselves seemed to laugh back mockingly. The walls trembled with it, plaster quivering, portraits rattling upon their nails. The food clattered in bowls. The wine spilled unchecked. Bread lay torn across the tablecloth, its crumbs scattered like bones on a battlefield. Grease slicked the plates, meat stripped bare in frantic hands. Some stuffed food in too fast, chewing with mouths open, lips stretched wide as though feeding not hunger but obligation. And all the while Clara stood against the far wall, her gaze fixed. She neither smiled nor frowned. Her eyes held the room in silence, though every mouth within it shrieked with laughter. The shadows thickened around her feet, curling like smoke. Then the clock struck. One heavy toll, deeper than the hour should demand, reverberated through the room. It did not sound like brass striking steel. It sounded like wood breaking, coffin lid slamming, nails being driven home. The laughter wavered. Another toll. The mistress's smile faltered, the corners of her lips twitching downward, as though someone tugged them by invisible thread. Her hand dropped from her wineglass and it tipped, spilling red across her skirts like an open wound. Yet still her shoulders convulsed, as if she could not stop laughing. Her chest heaved in cruel rhythm, though no sound now came. The overseer's voice cracked mid-shout. He clutched at his throat, eyes bulging. His laughter had broken into gasps, but his body shook as if he was still laughing, ribs jerking violently beneath his shirt. The son's roar choked into a wheeze. He gripped his spoon, knuckles white, face flushed crimson. His eyes darted wide, frantic, yet his lips remained parted in a grin too wide to be his own, and the clock tolled again. The sound filled the air like earth shoveled onto a grave. One by one, the voices thinned. The laughter drained away, leaving silence punctuated by the scrape of chair legs against the floor, the rattle of silverware dropping from numbed fingers. The air thickened, the sweetness of the stew turning rancid, sour, cloying until it clogged the nose and throat. The mistress sagged forward, her face pressed into her bowl. Steam curled around her skin, wetting her powdered cheek until it slid away in streaks. The son dropped his spoon, which rolled across the table, striking another plate with a hollow ring. The overseer's chair toppled as his body convulsed backward, his laughter choking into silence. The guests fell in staggered rhythm, some collapsing onto the table, some onto the floor. Some prayed in whispers, their words slurred and breaking. Others cursed, gasping foul names through froth at their lips. And Clara's eyes held them all. The candles would not die. Their flames rose higher, throwing the scene into merciless clarity. Every fallen face gleamed, eyes wide open, staring. The wax streamed faster, dripping onto the tablecloth, hardening into shapes that writhed and twitched before cooling. The clock tolled one last time, louder than before, so heavy the very glass in the windows trembled. And then stillness. The silence was not empty. It was swollen, thick, filled with the weight of too many unspoken voices. The air trembled with what had been summoned. Clara stepped forward. The hem of her dress brushed the fallen bodies, but she did not flinch. Her footsteps echoed as if she walked upon stone, not wood. Around her the dead did not close their eyes. The night had no softness left. It pressed upon the rafters, heavy as a coffin lid, while the dining room lay stricken in its own glow. What began as laughter only moments ago had soured into something brittle, something stretched too far. For on the table, where the polished silver and porcelain once gleamed, bodies now sagged like broken marionettes, each stilled by the same unseen hand. And yet, their eyes would not close. The candles, tall and defiant, burned with unnatural steadiness, their flames refusing to flicker even when the breath of death swept through the hall. Their wax ran down like ivory rivulets, clinging to the brass holders as if they too resisted sleep. The air, heavy with the scent of spiced stew and spilled wine, carried another note now, something faint, something metallic, as though the room itself had inhaled blood and could not exhale it. Clara stood at the threshold, her shadow spilling longer than her frame could cast. No one looked at her in life, but in death they could not escape her. Their eyes locked upon her without choice, glassy and still, unblinking, yet filled with questions that had no tongue to shape them. "Do you see now?" she whispered, her voice a ribbon that seemed to curl around their throats. "Do you feel what it is to stare without power, to hunger without hand, to breathe but never draw the air you crave?" No answer came, save the faint dripping of stew from overturned bowls, the dark liquid spreading into the fine white tablecloth like ink into parchment. The silence was louder than their laughter had ever been, and in that silence, the dead accused her, not with words, not with cries, but with eyes that would not dim, some were wide, as if still in disbelief, frozen at the edge of protest. Some narrowed, filled with fury, their veins bulging purple against pale skin, daring her to take pride in this desecration. And some, pitifully, were clouded already with prayers, lips stopped mid-hymn, hands curled into stiff gestures of devotion. But all of them, every gaze remained fixed upon Clara, unwilling to grant her the release of blindness. She stepped forward, the hem of her dress brushing the floorboards, her bare feet leaving no sound. With each movement, the air seemed to grow denser, as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening. She reached for a goblet that still stood upright, crimson wine trembling within. Her fingers closed around it, and she lifted it to her lips. The room seemed to flinch. "Drink," she murmured, tipping the vessel. The wine touched her mouth but did not pass her tongue. Instead, she poured it over the nearest body, staining the lace collar deep red, as if to baptize them in their own indulgence. "Drink what you loved more than mercy. Drink what you used to silence the cries from the quarters. Drink as the river shall drink you." A murmur rose then, but not from the lips of the fallen. It was the sound of something moving in the timbers, something shifting behind the walls. The chains in the slave quarters, far across the yard, shivered as though pulled by unseen hands. Clara heard it, felt it vibrate through her marrow, and for a moment, her gaze lifted from the dead to the rafters above, where shadows clung thicker than smoke. Still, the eyes below did not relent. They followed her as she moved around the table, their whites gleaming against the dim. She could not unmake their stare. She could not soften the fire within their sockets. It was as if some force older than the plantation, older than the river itself, demanded that they bear eternal witness to what she had wrought. A child's eyes stared too, wide and round, frozen in innocence never granted time to ripen. Clara paused before him, her own eyes burning with something sharper than grief. "I did not poison you, little one," she whispered. "I freed you from their house, their table, their lash. You will not grow to wear their cruelty like skin. Better to end before the rot takes root." But even his gaze accused her. His eyes gleamed with a sorrow too ancient for his years. And Clara felt for the first time a chill deeper than any chain had ever placed upon her body. The candles still would not die. Their flames stretched upward, hungry, illuminating every face in cruel clarity. The dead seemed restless, not in body but in spirit, their stares pressing upon Clara until she felt them crawling across her flesh like insects. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. The silverware rattled, though no hand touched it. A spoon fell clattering against the floor, but the sound was muffled, as though swallowed before it could echo. "Then watch," Clara hissed, her voice breaking into steel. "Watch until your eyes wither in their sockets. Watch as your fields rot, as your blood seeps into the soil. Watch until the river forgets your names." And still they watched, Her voice faltered then, for though defiance clung to her words, she knew the curse of the gaze would linger. It was not she who had bound them to their sight. It was something else, something older, something that had waited for her hand to stir the pot and invite it in. Outside, the night thickened. The cypress trees bent as though straining to glimpse through the windows. In the quarters, the chains moaned again, not in despair but in warning. The very soil of Natchez seemed to shift, as though a great beast turned beneath the earth, and Clara, though unbowed, understood. What she had loosed would not end with supper. The eyes would not close, and neither would the night. The silence of the plantation broke not with thunder, nor with screams, but with the sound of chains, soft, deliberate, whispering as though the iron itself had learned to speak. In the slave quarters, where breath was usually drawn in hushed terror, something shifted. The fetters nailed into walls and floors, the collars clamped upon posts, the lengths of iron that had rattled through countless nights, these began to weep with a dampness not born of storm. They sweated rust as though rain had fallen within the rooms themselves. Yet no clouds hovered, no rain tapped the roof. It was the air that had grown wet, the very boards weeping with a secret they could no longer contain. Men and women stirred from their straw mats, their eyes wide, their lips trembling. None spoke aloud, for it was not safe to speak of miracles. And yet, as they listened, they could hear the clinks and sighs of metal softening. Shackles slid against brick, groaning like tired bones. A chain pin driven deep into oak trembled loose without hand or hammer. A woman raised her arm. The cuff that had gnawed her skin for years slipped away like a serpent discarding its husk. She looked upon her wrist, raw and bleeding, yet she did not cry. She placed her freed hand over her heart and whispered the name that had traveled through the kitchens all day. Clara. The name was both prayer and spell. Elsewhere, a child who had been tied to a post by his ankle felt the metal cool, then crumble. He touched it, and the iron flaked like rusted bread, falling to dust on the dirt floor. He too spoke the name, not loud, not enough for the overseer to hear, though the overseer lay stiff in the big house now, his eyes forever open at the poisoned table. It spread, this loosening of bonds. The quarters breathed with the sound of chains falling, heavy thuds upon the ground, as though graves were being dug not with spade, but with iron. Every thud was a heartbeat. Every heartbeat was a promise, and still no one dared cry out in joy. They knew the land listened. The cypress trees stood tall as wardens. The Mississippi ran near, its black waters capable of carrying secrets or swallowing them whole. Freedom was not yet theirs to claim, but something older than freedom had walked into their midst, a man with shoulders bent from the lash, scars crisscrossing his back like broken rivers, stepped forward into the moonlight. His name was Elias. He had been whipped so many times that his very flesh seemed to speak in welts. The chains around his wrists fell, striking the ground with the sound of cracked bells. He knelt, pressing his brow into the dirt. "It has begun," he whispered, though to whom no one knew. From the distance, faintly carried by the night wind, came the echo of the dining hall. The laughter that had died, the prayers that had stopped mid-breath, the silence of the masters and mistresses now rotting upright at their table. Yet over this silence, the rustling of chains swelled louder, like 1,000 insects stirring underground. The air thickened. Some swore they heard voices, low humming, neither English nor African, but something deeper, something from the soil itself. The chains sang, if such a word could be used, not in melody but in resonance, iron striking iron, rust cracking like thunder, voices that were never permitted to rise now vibrating through metal, long corrupted by cruelty. "Clara," the voices seemed to say. "Clara, Clara." And in the big house Clara herself heard it. She lifted her head, her eyes still heavy with the stares of the dead, and she smiled. Not with joy, but with recognition. The dead had not closed their eyes. The living had not opened their mouths, but the chains had found a tongue. Back in the quarters, Elias rose, his freed arms trembling as though the flesh did not yet believe its own liberty. He lifted a length of fallen chain, holding it like a relic, and the others watched him. Children pressed close to their mothers. Old men leaned on sticks carved from pine. No one asked what came next, for the rust spoke clearer than any sermon. The world they had known was ending. The overseer's whip, coiled neatly on a peg, sagged. The leather softened, as though water seeped from within. The quarters seemed to exhale, each nail, each beam loosening with age it had not carried the day before. The entire plantation groaned like a living thing wounded unto death. Then from beneath the floorboards came another sound, a steady dripping, though there was no leak above. The ground itself bled moisture. Iron nails, long driven into the planks, hissed and corroded, streaks of rust spreading like veins of fire. Some swore they saw faces in that spreading stain, faces of ancestors long dead, their eyes glowing from the wood grain. The children began to hum, not in fear, but in rhythm with the chains. Their voices wove into the iron song, small and high, like reeds in wind. Mothers hushed them, but their mouths curved in secret smiles. For the first time in memory, the sound of bondage had become the sound of promise. Clara had poisoned flesh and bone at the table, but something deeper, older, had poisoned the very foundation of the plantation. The chains rusted in the dark, yes, but what rusted also were the laws, the prayers, the illusions of order that had bound this land in cruelty. The night was no longer theirs, and Clara's work was only beginning. The feast did not end with the masters. When the last laughter had curdled into silence and the bodies slumped against their silvered thrones, the doors of the great house remained ajar. Clara had left them so, whether by accident or intention none could say, for the swollen wood breathed open, as if it too longed to unburden itself. Through the widening crack seeped the perfume of death, sweet stew cooling into rot, wine gone sharp with air, candle wax dripping into pools of hardened yellow. The dining hall had become a shrine, and shrines demand worshippers. They came at first as whispers, a faint scratching in the wainscoting, a skitter across the boards. Then more, tiny claws echoing like rain on a hollow roof. Rats, lean and starved from years of scavenging scraps, poured forth from corners unseen. The walls seemed to birth them, the rafters to shed them, the very earth beneath the house to exhale them. One bold creature leapt upon the table, its whiskers twitching at the scent of spiced flesh. It set its teeth into a fallen morsel, gnawing with a sound too human, too like the grinding of molars in restless sleep. Another followed, then another. Soon the linen cloth writhed with their small black bodies, each eager to claim a place at the banquet that had once been denied them. Clara stood in the threshold, watching. She did not move to stop them. She did not even blink. In their frenzy she saw not vermin, but priests, each rat a minister in a holy procession, stripping away the finery of the dead, gnawing through lace, velvet, and silk, until only bone and gristle remained. Their chewing became liturgy, their squeals a hymn older than scripture. The slaves in the quarters whispered of it later. How Clara had opened the way, how she had given the house to the shadows and the rats, how she had declared that the feast belonged not to the masters, but to the earth and all that crawled upon it. To leave food untouched while the chained starved had been sin enough. Now that sin was corrected, in a dark and perfect symmetry, the rats swarmed higher. A jeweled brooch clattered to the floor, torn from a mistress's breast. A powdered wig fell askew, tugged by small sharp teeth until it lay like a scalp upon the boards. Forks toppled and spun, goblets rang like bells when knocked over, and the long table groaned beneath the shifting weight of vermin. Yet still the candles burned, steady as watchmen, forcing the dead to bear witness to their own undoing. The masters had gorged themselves for years on flesh not theirs, labor not theirs, lives not theirs. Now their feast was reclaimed. Every bite the rats took was a sermon. Every gnawing jaw declared, "This house is no longer yours," Clara whispered to them, words only the rats could hear. "Take and be filled. What was denied you is now abundance. What was wasted is now yours. Strip them bone to bone until not even their shadows linger." The rats obeyed. One fell into a goblet of wine, thrashing, drowning, its squeals shrill and sharp. Others clambered over its corpse and drank the spilt liquid, their bellies staining crimson, their mouths slick as if baptized in blood. Still others tugged at fingers adorned with rings, gnawing until the gold slipped loose, clattering against porcelain plates. No hand rose to stop them. From the rafters, a larger shape descended, an old rat, scarred and heavy, its tail as long as a whip. It claimed the head of the table, where the master once presided, its black eyes gleaming like polished coal. The other rats gave way, circling it in reverence. Clara's lips curved into a thin smile. The master had not left his place unfilled. His seat, too, had been inherited, only not by son nor kin, but by a creature of gnawing hunger. In the quarters, whispers turned to trembling song. The people knew. They could feel it in the air, hear it in the timbers. The order of the plantation had shifted. The lash no longer ruled. The whip no longer sang. The new rulers were smaller, swifter, more honest in their cruelty. All night the banquet continued. Flesh dwindled. Bones gleamed pale beneath candlelight. The hall that once echoed with the chatter of polished tongues now resounded with the endless scrape of teeth. Outside, the cypress trees bent low, as though bowing to this new liturgy. The Mississippi hummed in the distance, carrying the sound across its dark waters. By dawn, the vermin had eaten their fill. What remained upon the table was not a family, not masters, not mistresses, but husks, hollowed forms draped in lace, their eyes still open, unblinking, accusing. And yet the rats had not finished. They lingered, waiting, as though they knew another course would soon be served. Clara stepped forward, her hand brushing against the master's chair. She did not sit. Instead she spoke, voice low but clear. "You feasted on us. Now they feast on you. And still the feast is not ended." The largest rat twitched its whiskers, then dipped its head in what seemed a bow, and so the hall became theirs. The feast belonged to the creatures of shadow, and the plantation would never again echo with the laughter of its lords. Only the chewing, the scratching, the endless banquet of rats. The Mississippi has always carried songs, some born of sorrow, some of toil, some of drunken laughter spilling from the riverboats that cut across its back. But the song that rose on that night was of another kind entirely, one no church would claim. No hymnal would write, no preacher would dare repeat from a pulpit. It began low, almost beneath hearing, a vibration in the water like the groaning of the earth itself. Those who lived along its banks said later they felt it before they heard it, the soles of their feet tingling as if the ground itself hummed. Then came the notes, long wavering tones, soft as a cradle song but sharp as the draw of a blade. The Mississippi carried it, bending it around cypress roots, stretching it through cane fields, twisting it into hollows and gullies where no sound should dwell. The enslaved in the quarters rose from their mats, their chains already slack and rusting. They stood at the windows and door frames, listening. Some crossed themselves, others fell to their knees, pressing their ears to the floor, as though the very soil had become a drum. A few began to hum along, their throats dry, their voices quivering, uncertain whether they sang or were being sung through. "Do you hear it?" whispered an old woman, her back bent, her eyes cloudy with years. "It is not from men. It is not from women. It is older than both." And she was right. Clara walked alone toward the riverbank, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. The night around her pulsed with the song, filling her ribs, setting her teeth on edge. She did not cover her ears. She did not shrink. Instead, she followed it, as one follows the tolling of a bell into a darkened chapel. At the edge of the water, she stopped. The surface of the Mississippi gleamed black as obsidian, yet in its depths moved light, faint, phosphorescent, like fireflies drowned but still burning. The current writhed, restless, as if stirred by 1,000 unseen oars, and there, just above the waterline, Clara saw her reflection. It should not have been possible, for she stood in shadow, the moon half hidden behind drifting cloud. Yet her likeness shone upon the surface clear as silver glass. Her face, but not her face. Her eyes, but larger, filled with depths that had no bottom. She raised her hand, and the reflection raised its hand in answer, not with the delay of a mirror, but with the precision of another being mimicking her movement. A voice, if voice it could be called, slipped from the water. Not from lips, not from throat, but from the very river. It sang in a language without words, in vowels stretched into eternity, in consonants swallowed before they could be spoken. The sound wrapped around Clara, twined into her hair, pressed against her chest like a hand. The enslaved who had followed her, cautious, fearful, saw her silhouette framed against the water. They swore afterward that she swayed as if rocked in a cradle, her lips parted, her breath matching the rhythm of the river song. Some claimed she sang back, though no human tongue could have shaped those tones. The river answered itself in echoes. The song grew louder, its currents carrying it into every hollow, every field, every hidden place. Overseers lay dead in the house, their eyes wide. But still their corpses seemed to quiver at the sound, as if their ears had not yet rotted enough to block it out. The rats in the dining hall froze in their gnawing. They lifted their heads, wine-stained whiskers twitching, and listened. Even vermin knew reverence when the river sang. Clara leaned forward, her reflection rising closer until the surface rippled against her breath. For a moment she felt drawn, not merely in body but in soul, toward that mirrored self. She could step in. She could dissolve. She could vanish into the hymn and never return, but she did not. Instead, she whispered into the water, her voice low and sharp as a needle. Carry it. Carry them all. Take their names. Take their bones. Take their breath and let no priest bury it. Let the river remember. The reflection smiled. Not her smile. Something older. Something that had waited centuries to be called. And then the waters shifted, pulling outward, sending the hymn farther, wider. Cane fields rustled as if stirred by invisible hands. Cypress groaned, their roots deepening into the mud. Across the river, where other plantations lay, dogs woke and howled, overseers stirred in their sleep, and children cried out with no cause but the pressure of sound in their bones. It was not just a song now, it was a warning. It was a promise. The Mississippi carried it, winding like a serpent through the dark. Those who stood on the shore with Clara swore they saw faces in the water, faint, fleeting, human and not human. Some were kin long buried, others strangers with eyes like burning coals. All looked upward, their mouths moving in unison with the hymn. And when the song reached its final note, long, trembling, sinking into silence, the river stilled. The reflection vanished. Only Clara remained, standing with her hands still raised as if blessing or cursing the waters. The people behind her dared not speak. They only listened to the quiet that followed, a quiet too vast, too heavy, as if all creation held its breath. Then Clara turned, her eyes glinting. "The river has heard," she said. And once the river hears, it does not forget. The Mississippi flowed on, black and endless, carrying with it a hymn no church had taught and no heaven had claimed. Hay say that when the last ember dies, silence takes the room. But in this house the silence was not absence, it was speech. The hearth that once warmed the Sullivan name had long been blackened with soot, its stones cracked by time and weight. And yet the villagers swore that if you sat close enough, when the wind pressed against the chimney throat, you could hear words forming from the ash. Not the words of the living, not the words of prayer, but mutterings like the voice of something smothered, something buried alive beneath brick and cinder. It began when a boy, Samuel Price, dared to test it. He was young, no older than 15, filled with the cruel courage only children possess. His friends jeered him on as he knelt before the fireplace of the abandoned Sullivan estate. The house smelled of rot, of damp earth pushing through the floorboards, of iron nails that had rusted into veins of red-brown scars. Yet Samuel leaned close to the hearth and whispered his own name into the dark. At first, nothing. Then, as if breath had been waiting there for years, a sigh exhaled back at him. The ash shifted, and in a voice so faint it was almost thought, it repeated, "Samuel." The boy staggered back, pale, his mouth opening to scream but finding no sound. His friends laughed until they too heard it, the emberless hearth shaping their names, syllables warped as if dragged through water. Each one whispered, each one answered. Some left with bravado, but none slept well after. Samuel, most of all, never returned. Within 3 weeks his body was found in the creek, mouth packed with grey ash, though no fireplace stood within a mile. The coroner wrote it off as misadventure, but the old folk shook their heads. "The house keeps what it calls," they muttered. And so the hearth became another threshold no one dared cross. But the hearth was not idle. Even with no ears bent close, the ash spoke. Farmers walking the road at dusk swore they heard low chanting from within the Sullivan windows. Women hanging laundry claimed the wind carried fragments of words, old syllables too heavy for English, broken tongues that made the skin shiver. A midwife, Esther Calloway, told that once, when she walked past with her lantern, she heard her unborn child's name whispered through the cracks of stone. When she gave birth weeks later, the child was stillborn. She refused to leave her house for years after. The church tried to quiet these tales. Father Harrington preached that such whispers were tricks of draught and echo. But late in his years, he was seen lingering outside the estate himself, trembling hands clutching rosary beads so tightly they cut into his skin. He confessed nothing, But his sermons grew darker after. He spoke less of salvation, more of debts that cannot be paid, and of mouths that feed though no flesh remains. By 1855, the hearth's whispers were woven into every story of the Sullivan place. When doors slammed at night, when livestock miscarried, when dreams turned black and fetid, the hearth was blamed. Mothers threatened children with it. Speak no lie, or the Sullivan fire will call your name. Travellers avoided the road past dusk, for even the passing of a wheel could stir ash into syllables, yet there were those drawn to it. Some claimed that if you asked the right question at the hearth, it would not only answer but grant. A widow seeking her dead husband leaned too close and begged for a sign. She was found days later in her cottage, bed soaked in soot, her lips cracked and black as if she had swallowed cinders. Others sought to know the future, but the hearth, if it spoke, never gave fortune. Only doom, always doom, and still the whispers grew bolder. By the summer of that year, the ash no longer waited for visitors. It carried itself through cracks in the walls, sifted across the floor, curled beneath doors. Neighbors swore they heard voices outside their windows at night, whispers of children's names, whispers of secrets never spoken aloud. Men woke choking on soot that was not there when they opened their mouths. Women found grey handprints on their linens. It was no longer the house alone that carried the voice. The ash had learned to travel. And as it spread, the people came to a terrible realization. The hearth was not speaking with borrowed wind. It was not echo. It was not curse. It was confession. Something buried in that place wanted to be known, and it would not stop with the house. The Price family fled first, abandoning their farm and leaving their tools in the soil. Others followed, until that stretch of land became emptier than a churchyard. But even the absent could not escape. Letters were found written in soot upon doors, names smeared across mirrors, prayers blackened in the margins of family Bibles. It was as if the ash had claimed them all, and so the house remained, fireplace waiting, hearth ever hungry. To this day, the villagers say, the ash still speaks, but now it no longer waits for a name. Now it calls them itself.